Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. So today we are discussing 20th century American literature, and from 20th century American literature, the current video is about a famous novel Jazz by Toni Morrison, and in this video lecture we'll be knowing about the author and the plot summary of Jazz and the themes which are prevalent in Jazz. So, Toni Morrison was born on February 18, 1931, during the Great Depression. So, she took the name Anthony at her baptism, which led to the nickname Toni. Morrison's father, George Wofford, moved north from Georgia as a part of Great Migration. It was a mass migration of African Americans from south to the north and west in the 20th century, and worked multiple jobs to make both the ends meet. When Morrison was 2 years old, a landlord tried to evict the family because they could not afford rent. He set fire to the house with the Woffords inside when they refused to leave. Morrison heard this story often in a household where everyone told stories and spoke of their dreams with the same authority that they talked about what really happened. So, a childhood of stories, music, hardship, and family ties undergirds Morrison's novel. And this particular event of setting the house on fire is also reflected in her novel Jazz through her character Dorcas, who came from such an area where her house was burnt, and she was forced to leave the place and shift to another area. Morrison learned to read early and excelled in school, devouring novels and plays. After graduating from Harvard University in 1953 with a degree in English literature, she earned a master's degree at Cornell University and taught English at Texas Southern University for a time. Morrison entered the publishing field not as a writer but as an editor, assisting other African American novelists such as Gail Jones and Toni Cade Bambara. She published her first novel, The Bluest Eye, in 1970 to promising reviews. So then she became popular as a writer. Beforehand, she was having a fame, but as an editor. So after going through such a situation and having a capacity to write about her own self, she began to write with The Blues Eye, and then she earned a fame as a renowned novelist and writer. Morrison is the recipient of many awards, including the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993 and Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. So, the novel Jazz is a 1992 historical novel by Pulitzer and Nobel Prize winning American author Toni Morrison. So, the majority of the narrative takes place in Harlem during the 1920s. However, as the past of various characters are explored, the narrative extends back to the mid 19th century American South. So, the novel forms the second part of Morrison's Dantesque trilogy on African American history, beginning with Beloved in 1987 and ending with Paradise in 1997. So, Jazz comes in between the second part of the trilogy, and that was in 1992. Dantesque trilogy is after Dante, the famous writer. So, it is a style of that writer which is characterized by impressive elevation of style with deep solemnity and somberness of feelings. So now coming to the chronological plot, because the novel is not in chronological order, the novel is more about a stream of consciousness in which the happenings are not dated chronologically. So they are haphazardly ideas which are coming to the mind of the writer, and she is writing them, she is penning them, and the reading of the text becomes confusing. So, before going to the detailed commentary on Jazz, which is in second lecture of 20th century American literature, will be going through the chronological part. So, the chronological part is order-wise summary, which is from the beginning to the end in a chronological way. So, first of all, we'll be talking about Toni Morrison's views about the plot of Jazz. So, Toni Morrison, being a native of all those settings which she has been describing here, she said in an interview that she put the whole plot on the first page of Jazz. Various characters then address events of the plot, turn them over and over, and explore them to make sense of them. This plot summary is arranged chronologically for your reference, and the earliest events in Jazz happen in 1850s, which we are told through the text, before the Civil War and Emancipation. In Vienna, and that is part of Virginia, so that is where the setting is, Vera Louise Gray, she is a daughter of a wealthy white man. She has an affair with Henry Lestroy. He's an African American man, and she becomes pregnant. Her father, Colonel Wordsworth Gray, disowns her but gives her enough money to live in Baltimore, so she is forced to leave the house and go there and settle there. And that is because of her adultery, and that is because of her illicit relation, which was kept hidden, and she was shunned out of her house by her father, who is Colonel Wordsworth Gray. True Ballet is Vera Louise, 27 years old slave. She goes with her to help in raising the child, who is an adored child's son called Golden Gray because of his pretty blonde curls. When Golden Gray turns 18, True Ballet tells him who his father is, and when he's angry and shocked on it and confused as well, he travels to Virginia to meet his father or to find him. On his way, he encounters a naked and heavily pregnant woman in the woods by the road. The woman tries to flee but hits her head, and she collapses and she faints. So Golden Gray reluctantly takes her into his carriage. Though he is put off by her dark skin and the blood coming from her head, he arrives at a small house that he believes to be his father's and waits with the unconscious woman until Honor, a young teenage character, arrives there. Honor confirms that the house belongs to Henry Lestroy, who is away hunting but will return soon. Honor looks after Henry's livestock while he is gone, so he is tending him. He tends to the pregnant woman, cleaning her wounded head. When Henry arrives and realizes that he has a son, he understands why Vera Louise left. So beforehand, he did not have any idea why did the lady went or where did she go. So now he realizes that this was the reason that she was expelled from her house by her father. Just like as a father and son are meeting. However, the injured woman goes into the labor, so she is having her labor pain, and because she was expecting. Honor and Henry help her, but in her pain she bites Henry's cheek, and which leads him to name her Wild. So this is how she is given the name Wild, because she she bit on Henry's cheek while in her pains. Wild does not want a baby boy, but she is never far from him and hiding in the woods. The boy, Joe Trace, grows up with a foster brother, Victory, but they leave Vienna to find work when the African Americans in the area are stripped of their land. So this is how they're migrating, because in the time of riots, the African Americans were forced to leave their lands and settle somewhere else. So Joe was one of them. So Joe Trace was one of those people who was forced to go, and he had to go there because of whatever was happening. And then this happens that Joe Trace leaves everything behind, and he goes with his brother to a field, to another place where he is to work. And Henry implies that Wilde is Joe's mother. So Joe seeks out Wilde several times and attempts to speak to her, but unable to interpret her gestures because of her inability to speak, he remains unsure. Violet, too, is growing up in the South at this time. So, at the same time, Violet, another main character of the novel, she is growing up, and she is nearby. Her mother, Rose Dear, is True Ballet's daughter, married to an irresponsible man who is absent for long periods and then shows up with gifts only to leave again. And Rose Dear collapses under the same strain. So, this is another revelation for the readers that Violet, who happens to be granddaughter of True Ballet. So True Ballet was the same lady who escorted Joe Trace's mother to a place which was unknown, and so this connects Violet and Joe Trace in a way that Violet belongs to the family of the servant of Joe Trace. Meanwhile, True Ballet, who was no longer a slave, she returns from Baltimore to take care of Violet and her other siblings, but Rose Dear kills herself by jumping into well. And this is how, like, she spent a life full of misery. So she was always miserable. And when Violet is 17 or 18, True Ballet sends her to work in a cotton harvest, and there Violet meets and falls in love with Joe Trace. They marry and live for several years in Virginia, but when Joe is evicted from the land he bought, they join the Great Migration north and arrive in Harlem in 1906. So it was a great migration. We'll be talking about this migration almost in the end of the lecture. So this great migration was about, like, people were evacuating their places in a mass order, and it was a huge crowd that was leaving the countryside and shifting to the cities because of the economical conditions and because of the riots there. So there Joe works as a door-to-door cosmetic salesman, and Violet cuts and styles hair. So she has several miscarriages, but gradually they grow apart as Violet becomes largely silent. So one of the reasons they were together because they found that there is some chemistry between them. So they fall in love with each other and they married each other. But later on, because of the migration and then their being hand to mouth, and then Joe working as cosmetic salesman and spending most of the times outdoor, Violet most of the times busy in cutting the hair of the people around. So in this way, they were having very short amount of time left for each other. Moreover, there were so many miscarriages of Violet, and after suffering through those miscarriages, she was all the time silent and she was all the time in depression. So this depression made her more silent. First of all, her loneliness, and then her depression, her miscarriages. So everything added to her silence. So she was no more a smiling and laughing lady, which she used to be when she first met Joe Trace in a cotton harvest. So now we are next told about Alice Manfred. Alice Manfred has also made her way to the city by this time. So by the time Joe Trace and Joe Trace and Violet settled in Harlem, in the meanwhile, Alice Manfred, along with her niece Dorcas, also came to Harlem City. So, in 1917, her 17 years old niece Dorcas is orphaned during the riots in East St. Louis and comes to live with her aunt, a fearful widow. Alice tries to protect her niece from the city's temptation, but Dorcas and Joe meet when he comes to Alice's apartment to sell cosmetics because he is door-to-door salesman. He sells cosmetics to the people at their houses. So once he comes to Alice Manfred's place where he sees Dorcas, and they start liking each other since the first glance. So Dorcas and Joe have an intense affair. Looking, but that is intense and short at the same time. That's not quite long-lasting affair. So Dorcas soon tires of Joe, despite his attention and gifts, because of his age. So age, youth, and age is also a theme in this play. So we tend to know that Dorcas, since she was not having an interaction with people much, and her aunt was putting so many restrictions on Dorcas, so she fell in love with the first person she ever saw. So it was Joe Trace, and but in very few times she started realizing that Joe was not the perfect person. He was old, and he was not into dancing, which she liked the most. So she loves to dance, listen to jazz music, and be among people of her own age. Dorcas begins to date a young man, Acton. So another person comes to her life, and she starts to avoid Joe Trace. So despite her suspicion that Joe will react badly. So when he hunts her down at a party and sees her dancing in a club with Acton, she is not surprised because she is not trying to pose something. She portrays, or she shows that she is fed up of Joe Trace. So Joe shoots Dorcas and flees. Dorcas, on the other hand, refuses to send for help and bleeds to death during the night. So this is what happens to her, that she dies in the very place, in the very night. So rumors of their affair spread and reached the ears of Violet around the time of Dorcas' funeral. So by the time Violet also comes to know about all this thing, and here she comes to know about all the affair and all the intensity of that and the ending of that. She comes to the funeral, and she opens the coffin and slashes Dorcas' face with a knife before the men throw her out of the church. So this is a violence committed by Violet. So Violet becomes violent in a way that she tries to take revenge from the corpse of Dorcas. So here we also come to know that whatever happens afterwards is a result of whatever was done by Joe Trace, since they were already apart from each other. This thing made them aloof, even more aloof from each other, and they were not on better terms. Most of the times they were spending in silence and in guilt. We have now Harlem Renaissance. So Harlem Renaissance is about the city where the all events taking place, which we're studying. So Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, spanning the 1920s. At the time, it was known as the New Negro Movement, named after the New Negro, a 1925 anthology edited by Alan Locke. The movement also included the new African American culture expressions across the urban areas in the Northeast and Midwest United States affected by Great Migration, of which Harlem was the largest. So, all the people who came to Harlem were the outproduct of that Great Migration which happened, And since Harlem was the largest city in the Northeast and Midwest, so most of the people came here, and Alice Manfred, Joe Trace, Violet Trace, Dorcas, so they happened to be belonging from little towns or countrysides or little cities who, in a result of the Great Migration, came and settled in Harlem. So, in the same way, there was the intellectual movement in there, in which there were so many literary works written. So that is why it is called a Renaissance, because it was a revival of another learning which was based on culture and which was primarily about the lives spent by the blacks who came here, and the racial issues and the cultural issues which they suffered, and all the tragedies they came through. So all those things are the prevalent themes and topics of Harlem Renaissance. So the Great Migration, about which we have been talking before, sometimes known as Great Northward Migration or the Black Migration, it was a movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern United States to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West that occurred between 1916 and 1970. So it was a huge time span in which people migrated, and more than 6 million people migrated from towns, small towns, cities, and countrysides. It was caused primarily by the poor economic conditions as well as the prevalent racial segregation and discrimination in the southern states, because racial discrimination and segregation was more in the southern states. So people from the southern states, they traveled towards the north, and Harlem happened to be the largest city, so most of the people occupied it as their abode, and they started living here, they started shifting here. Now coming to the themes, we have so many themes in this novel. So the most prominent and prevalent theme is the motherhood. So mothers are almost always absent from the lives of Morrison's characters, having abandoned their children, died, or simply disappeared. So this is most of our novels depict that people are often, they're not having their parentage or parenthood, or they're not having especially their mothers, or they're not feeling the love of the mother. So the absence of mothers also reflects the absence of a motherland, as the African American community searches for a way to make America its own despite the horrors of dislocation and slavery. So slavery in the times of Abraham Lincoln and even before that, it was a very common practice in America, and Negroes and blacks, they were treated as slaves, and they were purchased and sold. So this was a very bad practice, it was a malpractice of the time. So motherhood also refers to the motherland, because those Africans, blacks, they were not having their own land where they could live happily. So since they wanted to live in America, but they suffered frequent dislocations, they had to change from one place to another, and they had to change their places. So this pertains to motherland as well. The mother also signifies a common cultural and racial heritage that eludes the characters as they struggle to define themselves. Like the word mama rests on the tip of the character's tongue and is an unconscious lament for a lost home or feeling insecurity. So talking about whenever they're feeling insecure or whenever they're lamenting, the word comes to the mouth of almost all the characters in her novels. During one of Violet's visits, Alice Manfred blurts out, "Oh, Mama," and then covers her mouth, shocked at her own vulnerability. So even Alice Manfred, who happens to be an elderly woman, she remembers her mother as an expression of lamenting, and then she realizes what she had just said. Dorcas also refers to her mother out of nowhere as she lies on her deathbed thinking, I know his name, but Mama won't tell. So again, Dorcas is missing or remembering her mother before she dies. Morrison's narrator, who's ever present in jazz, begins with a recap of Dorcas' murder and Violet's attack on her corpse. The couple that kills and then defaces the young girl seems immediately to be evil and immoral character, and uh, like and in the same way, but surprisingly, Morrison goes to flesh them out and to explain that the violent act stems from the suppressed anguish and disrupted childhoods in which they were not having the love of a mother with them. So this is what they were facing, this is what they were feeling. So this absence of motherhood tended to develop a sort of uh, a violence in those people. So the violence that we find in the novel, the murder of Dorcas and what happened to her afterwards, and the way Violet goes and tries to deface her face, is one of those examples of violence which is there because of the absence of motherhood. So violence is the second theme which we find in this novel. So in uh, Morrison traces the violence of the city characters back to Virginia, where generations of enslavement and poverty tore families apart. And certainly, Morrison suggests that the black on black violence of the city carries over from the physical and physique violence committed against the race as a whole. So, she also gives a description of the violence that was that was a result of a racial discrimination. So many people were killed in those riots and between that shifting of which is known as Great Migration. So violence is not only in the novel but also working as the backdrop of the novel as well. And then she interweaves allusions to racial violence into a story with a neutral tone that lets the historical facts speak for themselves. Further, her depictions of scenes are often filled with violence as she discusses buildings which are cut like a razor like line of sunlight. So, even this beautiful depiction of nature, she is using violent words like razor like. Even her narrative is violently constructed with stories wrenched apart, fragmented, and retold in a way that mirrors the splintered identities of the novel's principal characters. So, the way we find that there is no chronological harmony in the novel, and the incidents that she's discussing are incoherently arranged with each other. So, this is also a remembrance of the violence or a result of the violence that she suffered and she saw people suffering through. And then the next major theme is race. So while with its shape shifting, the omnipresent narrator who is present everywhere, because there is an unknown narrator who is telling the story, narrating the tale, jazz immerses its readers in the psyche and history of its African American characters. The book attempts to mirror from an anthropological and fictional standpoint the concerns of this community and the roots of their collective search for identity. The narrator does not travel far from the self contained universe of Black Harlem and does not focus on the lives of any white characters, save for Vera Lois Gray, who was indispensable to the novel. The legacy of slavery reverberates throughout the story, and the influx of blacks to the city reflects the distancing from his past, from this past. So, in this way, we come to know that race is playing a major role in the novel. It is the sole or the backbone of the novel, which is there. That is why even Toni Morrison is very much concerned about this thing. Even she is not willing to give a prominent role as a character to any white person. All the characters that she has delineated are black, and they belong to that suffering race, the race which was suffering troubles, miseries, atrocities, cruelties, injustice, and dislocation, and the frequent dislocation, rather, I would say. So, and the next theme again is the dislocation, migration connected to this. So almost all of the Morrison's characters migrate to New York City from other parts of the country in an attempt to escape economic and social prejudice and in search of a new start in Harlem. The motive of migration goes hand in hand with the numerous allusions to the birds and recurs frequently in the narration of the characters' histories. Melvin's nephew, William the Younger, exemplifies a constantly shifting and a black population with this sudden departure from New York for Chicago, or was it San Diego or some other city ending with O? His young like self that we realize is uh, thinking about that self. So, migration happens to be there everywhere. We find people going from one place to another, from New York to Chicago, from Chicago to New York, from little cities to big cities. So, we find it prevalent. We find all the blacks migrating, we find all of them moving from one place to another, or either by choice or either by force they are dislocating themselves. So, even Alice Manfred is here, Joe Trace is here, Violet Trace is here, Dorcas is here. So, four of the main characters of the novel have suffered the migration or that dislocation here. So, next theme is Orphans. The absence of a strong parental presence in jazz ties together many of Morrison's characters and connects their shared sadness to one cause, because as we have already discussed that most of our characters are not having their motherhood or parentage. So raised by aunts, grandparents, and adoptive parents, like in the form of Joe Trace, Violet, and Alice Manfred's niece Dorcas. So all of them have suffered or gone through this thing. So all experience a feeling of displacement. So displacement is not only, they're not only suffering from physical displacement, which is a migration, but also a mental or emotional displacement, which is signifying the absence of their real parents, and their being present or being in adoptive cases in such a circumstance where they're not happily living. Like Dorcas is not at all happy with her aunt because she puts restrictions on her, and the characters of Toni Morrison, they feel that they are handed over with no control, like they have lost their self control on them. So unable to control the fact that they're orphans and placed in homes without any choice in the matter, characters are relocated in a way that resonates with the parentalistic adoption of slaves. So all the characters almost who either are living with their aunt or with their grandfather or with their stepfather, all are going through the same trauma, like they are not adopted, like they are made slaves. So they are being treated like slaves there. Their true parents would be the tie to a history and would provide an identity for the characters. That is why Joe Trace in the novel keeps searching for his mother, and his name Trace is for this reason, that he is finding the trace of his parentage. Thus, the lack of parents creates a character's sense of displacement and their obsessive desire to find a stable and complete identity. This is what we find in the novel. So, in the novel again, we have something about the music too. So, music is according to some critics, they say that jazz music is the narrator of the novel. So, at the same music, as the title of the novel implies, music operates both thematically and formally to provide structure to the novel. The jazz music of the 1920s situates the narrative in a specific culture and historical moment when a black aesthetic style was gaining ground in New Orleans and New York. Both the city and the woods of Virginia are described as having their own music and rhythm, and the pace of the narrator's storytelling ranges from upbeat and which is fast to slow. Uh, like music also speaks to the individual characters on deep level, as when Alice Manfred worries about the sinful powers of the music. However, music can be restorative, as Phyllis, who is another character, she's a friend of Dorcas, facilitates the healing process between Joe and Violet by bringing them over the records and watching them dance. So, music in this novel is working as a living character, as a narrator, as a violent thing, as a backdrop of the novel, and something it is also working like a balm that in the end connects Violet and Joe with each other together. So they end on a compromise and they start living a good life together. So music, Alice Manfred says that music is sinful. Jazz music creates such sinful thoughts in the people. So music is treating people differently, and people are treating this music differently. So music happens to be everywhere, and the way music is sometimes very fast, jazz music, it is the characteristic of the music, and sometimes it is slow. So that is also the pace of the narrator in the novel, that sometimes the narrator is too quick and sometimes it is too slow while exploring the things here. Next we have birds. So, according to the local Virginia law, whilst proximity is always indicated by the flight of red-winged birds from nearby trees. So, Wild is the same lady who was who came across Joe Trace and his father. So, the workers in the sugarcane she came across golden gray, my mistake. So, the workers in the sugarcane fields established their own set of symbols in the neutral word based on shared stories and experiences. The collective recognition of red-winged bird as a herald of wild's presence illustrates the richness of a community's bonds, and unlike Violet's caged birds, the bird in Virginia have not lost their instinct of flight. Unlike the women that they shadow, they represent freedom from society's bonds. So there are two kind of birds there. So first is the red-winged birds, which were there in Virginia, and they were representing youth, warmth, love, passion, and freedom most of all. And then we come to know about another type of birds which are kept by Violet in a cage. It is the time when she is living an aloof life and silent life, when her husband is having a relation with Dorcas. He is not giving time to Violet. Violet has suffered miscarriages and she cannot concentrate, and she is becoming violent and silent both at the same time. So she keeps a bird and she starts talking to the bird to remove her loneliness. So this very bird is a symbol of silence, a symbol of cold attitude, a symbol of slavery. So this kind of bird is not for freedom, rather this comes for bondage, for restrictions, for slavery. So next we have memory. So memory is mostly developed through the presence of several orphans in the novel, and while Dorcas is the only young orphan in the story, so most of the development of this theme actually comes through Joe Trace. So Golden Gray and the relation, and about he is told about his parentage, Joe is told about his parentage, Violet has her ancestors, and Dorcas remembers her family. So all these things tend to tell us that characters are using their memory. So they may be using their memory to remember the good old days, or they're being nostalgic about them, or they're using the memory to escape from the present realities. Most of them may not be having good memories as well, like Joe Trace was not having very good memories. Violet and Dorcas, they were not having very good memories, but still they have mixtures of good and bad memories with them, which they keep remember throughout the novel. And youth and age is also a prevalent theme which comes in front of us in shape of Joe Trace and Dorcas. So Dorcas represents a tender age, and uh, Joe Trace represents old age, and a combination of them, like when they are both are combined for a shorter period of time. So this is amalgamation of youth and age, but this does not sustain long, because Dorcas is more interested afterwards in her own age fellows. So these were the prevalent themes in the novel which we are to study. So these are the references. You can get help from these as well, and you can get plenty of other resources about jazz novel. So I tried my level best to bring the easiest resources to you. So thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.